One of our goals at the farm is to convert as much space as we can over to native grasses because they're more drought tolerant and they serve other benefits like bringing in birds. Here's how we converted a couple different spaces on the farm using direct seeding and also how we planted our own plugs at home to save some money.
Little house on the prairie featuring Ma and Pa, Mary, Laura,
their little dog Jack.
Anyway,
this area was full of sod grass. It was mostly Kentucky bluegrass and some fescues, and it was very, very water thirsty. You can see here that some of it was already dead just because it had been such a hot, dry summer, and quite frankly, we were really tired of watering it. So we started by doing a really light surface till. Now, we are a no-till farm, so whenever possible, I don't like to till, but there are certain situations where it can be useful, and this is one. This ground was really compacted, so putting down seeds was going to be problematic. They would have a hard time germinating. And the other issue is that there was a mat of vegetation here, so we were going to have to get that up. There's lots of different ways to go about this. We'll talk about some pros and cons here at the end of the video.
we had grass that was pretty much dead already. If you had really established sod, you might want to run a sod cutter. They cut the sod off at soil level. Now, if you have rhizome-based weeds, you're not going to want to till anything at all. Rhizome weeds are going to spread with tilling, so you don't want to do that. But we did, because this area, it had grass, but it was really pretty much dead. It had weeds, but not rhizome stuff. So what we've done now is we've come through, and I've used a hard tine rake like this, and I've just raked up all of this stuff. This is just kind of the dead grass. Now, you could leave this in. If your grass is totally dead, say you hadn't watered it or you had solarized it and it's dead, then you don't have to worry about raking it out. You could leave the organic matter in the soil and just let it break down. So as you can see behind me, we've gotten prairie area 1 mostly prepped. So that is, we got most of the chunks of grass and all that stuff raked out of here. So it's a pretty good surface, I think, to be planting into. We've also watered it a couple times, and we waited about a week and a half, 10 days, to see what germinates in here. So that way, if any weeds pop up, we want to get them before we plant in, because it's just easier to weed right now, like with a hoe and just scuffle it up, than it is to weed once we have everything planted in here.
So now that we had the area prepped, we went ahead and overseeded. We used a mix of little blue stem, blue grama, prairie June grass, some blue bunch grass, and some prairie drop seed. So we used a mix of a lot of different kinds of native grasses. We mixed those with sand to scatter them onto the soil, which helped to weigh them down because it was kind of a windy day. Once we had that down, we covered everything up with a layer of frost fabric. Not only will the frost fabric help keep it moist while it's germinating, it will also help keep the wind from blowing it away. Once we have the frost fabric down, we just water directly on top of that fabric to help keep the ground moist. We did water it about twice a day, and if it was very dry, we'd sometimes water it 3 times a day.
All right, what did you think when I said we were going to get rid of all of our grass?
I said, where am I? Teach my kids to play football, soccer, baseball, rugby, polo.
But what's the reality?
I don't know.
They never do those things here. They do that at the park. And we do have a little grass still.
We got a little grass.
But for the most part, when the kids are doing big stuff,
Like those kinds of sports, they're doing it at the park. They're not really doing it in our yard. So anyway, let's look at our plants. I'm so excited I wet my plants. Huh? No.
We have a couple of golden currants ready to go, and we wanted to make sure we had some good bird berry stuff in there and also some good pollinator blooms. So that's where these shrubs come in, these golden currants.
And when we're looking at other shrubs that are good for our area, we are incorporating the sand cherry, and this sand cherry is kind of a lower growing sand cherry. There's one that gets a little bit taller, and then this one is kind of a ground cover and has these beautiful blooms, and the bees really love it, and it also smells great. So
We do have, let's see, there's a few weeds here popping up around the edges. So obviously these areas are spots we're gonna have to get in and pull by hand.
side, you just look like you're more videotaping the soil there. I'm watching, I'm always watching you.
Why you gotta be so creepy? All right, here we have prairie area number 2. So we did get a tree put in here. That's just gonna help give a little bit of shade to this area. So these don't get very big. This is a crabapple. If we are doing a prairie, we definitely wanna make sure that we're keeping these big shade-giving trees smaller, just because too much shade and this tall grass prairie isn't really gonna be able to grow very well, at least not with the plants that we've selected. Here's our last area, prairie area here. That we've seeded and put down the frost fabric. It hasn't germinated yet. It's just been 3 days, so we're just keeping it moist and watered at this point and just hoping for the best. We haven't had any rain. It's been really dry and hot, so that's been fun.
Okay, so here is the area that we seeded, and this is about 3 months later, so toward the end of the season, and you can see we got pretty good germination from all of the grasses that are in this spot. We did have a little bit of spotty germination in some areas, so I am going to grow out some plugs to put into those little spaces. So let's take a look at how we grow those plugs here at home.
What we have here is buffalo grass plugs. Buffalo grass is native to my area, but if I were to buy a tray of 72 buffalo grass plugs and have them shipped here, it would cost around $85 to $90. That's expensive when you're talking about doing a whole lawn. So instead, we're going to show you how to grow your own plugs so you can do your own lawn much more affordably. Now, why do we want to use plugs or small plants instead of direct seeding? You can do either one. Direct seeding is going to work just fine if that's how you want to start your native grass lawn. The problem is sometimes there's a lot of weed competition and things like that, and so when you're trying to seed, you might not know what's coming up. Is it what you actually planted? Is it a weed? Are you having to do a lot of hand weeding? So this is where using plugs can come in handy, because you already can see your plug, you know that they're big enough to compete with all the weed seeds and all of the other things that are growing in the lawn. There's not much that you need in terms of special equipment to get started with growing your own native grass plugs. It's really actually simple. You're just basically starting seeds. The only thing I would recommend you have is one of these deep cell trays. So these are actually extra deep trays, and the reason for that is pretty clear. So when we look at the bottom of these trays, you can see that there are roots coming out of the bottom. That's because most of our native grasses, especially if you're in the prairie areas where we have these tall grass prairies or even short grass prairies, they have super deep roots. This is how they're so drought tolerant, is because of these amazing roots. It's also what helps them sequester a bunch of carbon from the atmosphere. Win-win, win-win-win. And I'm gonna pull one out because I want you to see what the root system looks like. These have been growing for about 8 weeks, and you can see they are pretty ready to plant into the ground. They are starting to come out the bottom, and so that's usually the sign that they are ready to go. We don't want them to start curling inside of these trays, because then they can become root bound, and then they're not going to do very well when we plant them out. So we're going to plant them right as they're just starting to come out the bottom, and they look just like this. So again, these nice deep root tray systems are super helpful when you're planting in native lawn plugs. Now I'm going to show you, this is a particular trait of buffalo grass. So buffalo grass kind of spreads via these surface spreading rhizomes. So these put down roots along the soil, and that's how it spreads. So when you're planting plugs, you can space them out, and as they establish, they spread and they'll fill in the gaps in between. So this is why I like to use plugs, again, because you're going to get a good spacing, and you're not going to have to use very much seed. So it's a lot cheaper to start your native lawn with plugs than with seed, because it takes a lot less seed to get it started with plugs. I mentioned that it's more affordable to start with seed than it is to start. I mentioned that it's much more affordable to start from plug than to start with seed. Of course, that is assuming that you are growing your own plugs. If you're buying plugs, obviously it's going to be expensive. We bought, I believe this is 5 pounds of buffalo grass seed. It was not cheap. I want to say 5 pounds was somewhere around $400, but you don't need this much. Now, to put that into perspective, that would maybe be about 5 plug trays worth of buffalo grass plugs. But the seeds in here, I probably have enough seeds to do 1,000 plug trays. Let me show you how small these seeds are. and they have a really good germination rate. Whatever grass you decide to use, make sure that it's native to your region. If you're going with a native lawn, we're gonna seed it just like we would a garden seed. Okay, so just like a tomato, just like any of those, it's really, really simple and they germinate really easily. All right, so let's take a look at planting these in. These seeds are so crazy, like I really can't even, and I'm gonna do 2 or 3 of these per cell just because I wanna make sure that each one has one that actually germinates in each cell. You could do less if you wanna spread it out. You could go with just 1 seed, but I always like to make sure that every single one is full. Now with grass seed, I don't thin, so I'm not gonna thin these seeds at all. I'm just gonna let, if more than one germinates in the cell, it's fine. You don't have to thin it. Now we're gonna cover them up. So just like when we start seed, and we're gonna cover depending on what kind of seed you're starting. Some like it a little bit deeper, some like to be sown just on the surface. We're just gonna cover these guys about 1/4 inch of soil, and we're gonna keep them moist, just like any seed, any grass seed, any vegetable or flower seed. We just have to keep them a little bit moist as they're germinating. That's it, guys. Keep them watered until they germinate, and then you'll want to switch to bottom watering. So this is why we have our tray sitting in a 10-20 tray, so that we can water directly into this bottom tray and it can wick it up from the bottom. That's going to help those roots really have to reach down to the bottom, get those nice deep roots that we want for transplanting. All right, let's talk about transplanting these plugs into the ground so we can get our native grass started. Okay, so now that we have a couple healthy trays of our buffalo grass seed plugs, we are going to go ahead and plant them in. We're going to do them at about a 1-foot spacing. You can do anywhere from 12 to 18 inches. Depends on what type of grass you're using though. So remember, buffalo grass is one that spreads via those above ground rhizomes. So it's going to fill in naturally and spread. Make sure you do a little bit of research on whatever type of grass that you're using to find out how far apart to plant them. If you want your native grassland to fill in faster, you're going to plant those plugs a little bit closer together. And if you don't mind doing a little bit of weeding in between, then you can plant them a little further apart. So here's one of the plugs that we're planting in, and you can see with these grass plugs what can happen, especially with these native grass plugs. Because they have really deep tap roots, which is what enables them to be more drought resistant and also to sequester more carbon, they tend to get a little bit root bound in their containers because there is so much root. So when you're planting them, there's a couple things you'll want to do. You'll want to make sure you're pulling them gently apart so that those roots will be able to expand outward when they hit the ground. So I'm just gently loosening. And the other thing you'll want to make sure is that they're really well watered. So sometimes when the roots are really dense like that, they dry out toward the center really easily. So I'm going to give it a good water. And then when I'm planting it, I'm going to water the hole really thoroughly. So I'm going to dig my hole, and I'm going to do a couple things. I'm going to put that right in the hole. I'm going to give it a good water. And so that's doing 2 things. Number 1, it's wetting the area, but it's also making sure this plug is really nice and moist as we're planting it in. And then I'm going to fill in this dirt. So because we have really clay soil, this is kind of making a slurry, and that's going to fill in any possible air pockets or gaps, and it's also going to make sure it's really nice and moist. So I'm just gently pressing down, and then I'll give one more final water. You can kind of mound up the soil a little bit to make sure that water stays right where you want it, and then it's going to absorb, and this guy won't have to be watered again for about a week.
If I had to choose one of these 2 methods, either direct seeding or planting in plugs, it's hard to say which one I would go with because both were relatively successful. I would say that it has to do with your unique circumstances in your own yard. For example, if you have an area that has access to overhead irrigation, that would work better for direct seeding, versus if you have an area without overhead irrigation, that might work better for planting plugs. Another consideration would be the type of vegetation that was already existing in the space that you're trying to convert. So let's say that you were trying to convert a very weedy space that maybe has a pretty significant weed seed bank. It might be difficult to get seeds to establish there because those weeds might outcompete your native grasses. So those are just a couple things to consider when you're debating whether to do seeds or plugs.
While the seeds of our native grasses were much slower to establish than, say, sodgrass, Kentucky bluegrass, or any of those non-native grasses that grow fairly quickly, these ones took a little bit longer, but now that they're coming in, they are so green and lush, and it's only taken one season to get them here. So in hindsight, if I had to choose a method, I think I would do the seeding. If you're going to seed instead of using plugs, so remember, plugs are the little seedlings that are ready to plant in. If you're going to go with the seeding method, you have to make sure you have a really well prepared space. That means you have to get all of your weeds out of there, you have to kill off all of the existing grass and get a nice exposed area of soil in order to seed into. Otherwise, you're going to have trouble.